Hello, I'm Amy Hawthorne, Deputy Director for Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the fifth episode of our author interview series, Between the Lines. And I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Erin Snider to discuss her new book, Marketing Democracy, The Political Economy of Democracy Assistance in the Middle East, published by Cambridge University Press. Erin is Assistant Professor of International Affairs at Texas A&M University. Welcome, Erin, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy. It's a pleasure.
So a bit of background about this book's topic, which also happens to be a longstanding interest of mine. So I was very, very eagerly awaiting the publication of this book. Over the past 3 decades, the US government has spent an estimated several $billion in the Middle East and North Africa on foreign aid programs with the stated goal of, quote, promoting democracy. And these programs, which have been funded mainly by the US Agency for International Development, include such things as support for civil society organizations, technical assistance for parliaments and judiciaries, media strengthening, training for political parties, and the like. And all of these programs are ostensibly aimed at challenging the power of authoritarian regimes and at promoting more democratic modes of governance. And Erin, in her really masterful book, traces US democracy aid in the Middle East from its emergence in the early 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, during the George H.W. Bush administration, through the aftermath of the 2011 Arab uprisings during the presidency of Barack Obama. And drawing on deep research, including extensive field work in Egypt and in Morocco, Erin provides in her book many valuable insights about how this aid worked in practice and why its impact was so limited. Erin, your book is a fascinating read. Congratulations. And I have so many questions for you, so let's jump right in.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm excited for our chat today.
Absolutely. So to start off, let me ask you, why do you think the US government has funded democracy aid programs in the Middle East in the first place? Most of the target governments, of course, are not authoritarian adversaries that the US was seeking to undermine, but very close US security partners. So why has the US provided this kind of assistance in this part of the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, I think the answers to it would vary depending on which time frame we might have started at, right? So if we go to the earliest time frame in which these programs were initiated, which, as you said, again, was in the early 1990s, it was very much in line with what USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, again, this is the main U.S. agency that's charged with managing foreign aid in general, and particularly that for democracy aid, as well as the State Department, were really, again, in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, revolutions in Eastern Europe, really felt vindicated at this particular moment in history that, the sort of reading, the crude reading was our model won. This is a vindication that what we're doing, what we in the United States are doing is correct. And we need to go and spread this particular model around the world. And in the early 1990s, there were some really ambitious efforts that were undertaken by USAID in particular to try and figure out how to do this. So in the Middle East, Egypt and Morocco were 2 of the countries that were the focus of those early efforts. You'll notice, of course, it's not, a country like Saudi Arabia. And to the point that you made, of course, that, Egypt and Morocco were very close security partners of the United States. In my research and in discussions with people who were very much a part of those early discussions, the sort of rationale was, well, these are 2 countries that are close to the United States. We have a close security partnership with those 2 countries. These seem like the countries we should focus on as part of our early efforts. Egypt, of course, had an additional sort of check mark next to it in terms of it being, the largest, most influential Arab country in the Middle East as well, too. And so it was very much seen by people in the administration then as being a crucial part of the US's early efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East. But again, this was also part of, again, a worldwide effort to focus on democracy promotion throughout the world. Nigeria, Indonesia were also big countries, targets of the administration's early efforts. So while these efforts began in the early 1990s, of course, people who've studied this area know that there were some earlier attempts at democracy aid called something different entirely.
Right. Not using the D word, right?
Not using the D word, using another D word in some ways, using development assistance or some sort of permutation of that during the early 1980s. So again, we see the first ambitious, most, I think, the concerted, strategic efforts at this aid really begin in the 1990s, but the seeds of it were already there, 10 years, 15 years earlier before.
So interesting. And you pose the really it might seem like an obvious question, but it's very, very important to keep in front of mind is why governments in the Middle East and North Africa, why these authoritarian regimes would even accept US funded democracy programs in their countries in the first place. And drawing on the title of your book, how did the US government, what did you find about how the US government marketed these democracy programs to Arab regimes?
Yeah, so as you know, that question, which seems completely obvious to anyone who's thinking about this, or particularly scholars of democracy assistance in general, why would an authoritarian regime even allow this form of aid? Because the scholars of democracy aid know this form of aid is meant to challenge, hybrid regimes, authoritarian regimes, whatever permutation of regime dynamics we want to call it.
Right.
And it was something that was so obvious and yet missed in a lot of the democracy assistance literature. When I first began this research, 10, 15 years ago, in its first, iteration as a doctoral student. But answering this question struck me as enormously, consequential, right? In terms of bigger questions that scholars then had as they were beginning to try and understand how this aid works. Well, why isn't this aid working correctly? Why doesn't this aid, seem to be making an impact?
Yes.
You can answer that question. We need to, I think about why would this regime, even allow this form of aid, right? And the answer to that is, in some ways, is not surprising. In some ways, you can imagine they're getting something from this aid, right? And that, obviously, when we talk about states in the Middle East, you can't divorce security from the equation. And again, this is something that scholars of Middle East politics, of course, are already attuned to. But in my work, I wanted to know how this mattered, right? And so beyond just sort of stating the obvious, right, this is something that we imagine is working. Well, how is it actually working? And so if we can really sort of get down into the weeds, so to speak, to understand the mechanics of this aid, how it's being negotiated between donor governments like the United States and recipient governments, in the case of my book, the Egyptian and Moroccan governments, that should hopefully illuminate a great deal of how this aid is working or not working, or in some cases, as I show in my book, working perversely in many ways to reinforce rather than to challenge regimes in the region. And so, the short answer in some ways to this is, again, linked to the title of my book, Marketing Democracy. So the title is a nod to, first, the form of democracy that the United States was really promoting in the Middle East. And it wasn't just in the Middle East as well, I should say. But very much seeing the promotion of democracy as being bound to this notion of promoting a market economy, right? That if the construction of democracy assistance programs, is really about promoting market economies, the logic is if we have a market economy and all the sort of benefits that we think derive from this, then magically democracy in the way that we know it in the United States is going to take root in the Middle East. And I think most serious scholars and nuanced scholars, whether of the Middle East or elsewhere, know that things don't work in this simplistic fashion. But this was very much the way that people were talking in the early 1990s. And a lot of it, if we go back to that time frame, was again, linked to this idea of, the US sees itself and its model of democracy as the superior form, right? This vindication of a model that should work elsewhere around the world. And so, again, a lot of the early programs were very much focused on economic reform. The idea being that if you can spur economic growth, then the benefits from economic growth will trickle down and develop and make conditions right for expanding into other areas of democracy. And the political science literature at that time frame, in some ways, was backing up that assertion, and that's since been, it's one of the more contested ideas in political science. And in some ways, that does work in some parts of the world, but we have rich evidence now that relationship between economic reform and democratization is incredibly complex. And so what I found in my own work is that, economic reform there's nothing wrong with that per se, but understanding how authoritarian regimes can use this particular type of reform in ways that don't necessarily lead to democracy is important. In other words, that authoritarian regimes aren't necessarily invested in the mechanisms by which economic reform can give us democratization or democracy, or even political liberalization, as a precursor to democratization. And understanding that, I think, is extremely important. So, to the title of the book, Marketing Democracy, a form of market economic reform that was that featured as a key part of the US's democracy programs in the Middle East. And the issue of authoritarian regimes. How do you market democracy programs to regimes that would be resistant to this?
Right.
And so this is the marketing aspect of it. So in my book, I detail these really rich conversations and efforts that were happening at multiple levels between diplomats and bureaucrats working for the United States and their counterparts in the Egyptian government, and also their counterparts not necessarily working in the Egyptian government, but what diplomats refer to as local nationals. So in this case, Egyptian nationals, Moroccan nationals working with the USAID's missions in both countries. So there's a really rich cast of characters that I think often is neglected in the academic literature, of different people who were involved with negotiating, constructing, and executing these programs. And so what I show is, throughout the 1990s, up until the Arab uprisings, these efforts by a whole host of actors to push programs, democracy programs that the United States sees as potentially transformational, but definitely appreciates as threatening to the powers that be, and an effort at the high ends of the U.S. government not to disrupt the strategic relationship that the U.S. has, especially with a country as important to U.S. security interests like Egypt. So there are a couple of examples of this that I show in my book during the 1990s of efforts to, I think by many accounts, many would see these programs now as kind of banal, but in the 1990s, they weren't. So even a program that was about trying to encourage civil society or local political participation met with a lot of resistance in the 1990s by Egyptian officials. And USAID officials who were trying to negotiate these programs with their Egyptian counterparts met with a lot of resistance. And so they tried to push back in many cases, and they were basically told by their superiors to sort of back down. And many AID officials felt demoralized. They felt like, well, what's the point of this program if we're stepping back from our original aims and we're diluting things to satisfy, Egyptian government officials too. And so that was something that, featured as a prominent part of programs in the early 1990s, but you see different iterations of this, all the way up to the Arab uprisings.
And staying on this point of the role of the target governments or the target regimes of this democracy aid, one of the most insightful parts of your book, I think, was really describing the ways in which these regimes, in terms of your focus countries of Egypt and Morocco, how they were not passive recipients of this aid, or somehow because the United States was the more powerful party in the relationship, they were just forced to swallow their frustration or their resentment and just accept these kinds of assistance programs. But rather, they were active shapers of these programs in many cases. And specifically, can you tell us a little bit about what you found in your research about how these regimes, Morocco and Egypt, in the particular case studies of your book, how they negotiated with the U.S. government to dilute these democracy aid programs to make them less challenging to their own power, and in some cases maybe even aligned with their own interests. I guess the idea being, well, if we're going to be forced to have these programs in our country, the US government is telling us we have to do them. Let's try to negotiate them so they're as useful, either as benign or as useful for our regime interests as possible. So can you give us a few examples of how that worked with these programs?
Yeah, just as you mentioned, like it makes complete sense if you're an authoritarian government and you're trying to preserve, a useful relationship, right? You can't, again, if we think about things through the lens of leverage and bargaining power, we understand that, the US doesn't have the ability to dictate what it wants to see in these countries or in other states throughout the Middle East as well, too. There's so many examples, frankly, where we see this sort of dynamic play out in both countries. So I'll just pick one example from each country to sort of flesh out what I explained in more detail in the book. In Morocco, for example, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a great deal of focus on decentralization programs as part of USAID's overall democracy and governance programming in Morocco. And so decentralization, sort of the logic of it, as many people might know, is this idea of sort of devolving power from the center, and to the periphery, of empowering local cities, states, et cetera, governorates, whatever the measuring bit we're talking about here, whether it's Morocco or in Egypt. Decentralization programs were extremely popular, in some ways just because they'd been done before elsewhere, right? And it's sort of there's a sort of path dependency in so many ways with these programs. But the logic for many people was, okay, well, this doesn't seem overtly political, right? So we can talk about decentralization with our Moroccan counterparts as a way of making government more efficient, which, I mean, who would object to that? It deals with some issues and challenges that they've had over time. There are different ways of thinking about decentralization. There's political decentralization, there's fiscal decentralization, except no one would ever actually talk about the political decentralization component of it, as many people in both Morocco and Egypt would tell me. They acknowledged it, but they would talk about, I think they would talk about more fiscal decentralization because it, again, sounds less political. But again, the logic is, okay, well, if we're devolving power from the center, from whether in the case of Morocco, Rabat or Casablanca, to the periphery in the country, then maybe that might empower local communities and by extension, maybe create further down the road, empowered communities that are better equipped to challenge the central government. That's the most simplistic explanation of that. Except what we started to find, and we find this in USAID's audits of its own programs, were that these programs were not working in the way that its sort of creators thought they should or would. So we have scholars of Moroccan politics who, again, really extremely smart people who were commissioned to audit how these programs were working, and found, again, they weren't working in this way of empowering local communities, and instead they were functioning essentially to basically replicate the center in the periphery, right? So rather than, let's say, for example, challenging the Ministry of Interior in Morocco, they were basically empowering and strengthening the local representative of the Ministry of Interior in those particular locales. So again, to the question, are you empowering local communities and people? Maybe not. Maybe we're actually making the government more efficient and increasing its ability to sort of, again, survey what's going on in different parts of the countries. This is one example. And this is something there was a bit of back and forth about what these programs would do, what the US might have wanted to have done, but were prevented from doing so. And, I show in my book, many other examples of basically Morocco saying, you need us for security assistance, for issues of terrorism in North Africa, et cetera, and sort of leveraging that and its trade relationship, which is much stronger with its European counterparts in the United States, to sort of insulate itself from further demands by the United States. In Egypt, we see a similar dynamic, also decentralization programs, also the same sort of challenges and critiques that were made by people auditing these programs of, again, these aren't working to empower local communities, they're working to strengthen the central government, in fact. But there was another project in the late 1990s that began with the great intention of trying to empower Egyptian civil society, trying to enhance the organizational power, the service function of civil society organizations in Egypt. At around this time frame, in Egypt, they were negotiating a new civil society law as well. So the US ambassador, members of USAID thought this was a perfect opportunity to try and get the US or the Egyptian government on board with creating something that was going to be more responsive towards civil society, and also, hopefully having a civil society law that was also going to be less restrictive. Long story short, that didn't happen. The actual Egyptian NGO service center that was founded ran into a lot of challenges along the way. Lots of US officials that I spoke with that were working with it found again that their original intentions with this center were diluted down from their original objectives, because Egyptian government officials were not okay with the direction that it was taken. And one of the critiques, in fact, that a US official said in the end was like, well, it's a great program, it has a lot of progress, but by not thinking through the first, second, and third order effects of this kind of intervention, it perversely had the effect in the end of making it easier for the Egyptian government to sort of monitor Egyptian civil society, right? So being able to scrutinize what it was doing in a way that was also counter to its aims at the outset.
And that, as you say, that's another very important insight in your book, is you show how not only could these regimes very skillfully negotiate and dilute these programs to bring them closer to what they would accept on their terms, on their authoritarian terms, but in some cases, these programs perversely, and I think perversely is really the right word here, these democracy aid programs ended up giving enhanced powers to these authoritarian regimes, which is truly it's one thing for a foreign aid program to be ineffective and not really have much positive impact. It's another for those very programs to ultimately end up strengthening the very systems that the programs are designed to push up against. Is there another example that you might be able to share from your research of how the Egyptian government or the Moroccan government was able to use the programs, the training, the resources that came from these aid programs to actually strengthen their own powers?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of examples that stem from this Egyptian Service Center project in particular.
Right.
But one of the things I think that it underscores that I think it's really important to emphasize, as the United States is thinking about, we had the recent Summit for Democracy in December. There's a lot of big question marks about, what the United States should be doing, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, about these programs. And I think that, it's not for lack of good intentions and good ideas, right? But little, in some ways, little bureaucratic, I think, patience and tolerance to see programs out. And so, I mean, one of the things that I document in the book is, over the 1990s, we start, seeing two contradictory things. On the one hand, expansive rhetoric for democracy promotion, worldwide, even more expansive rhetoric for democracy promotion in the Middle East post 9/11. At the same time that rhetoric is happening and expanding, we see this, this gutting out, so to speak, of the foreign aid bureaucracy in the United States, where we see massive cuts to USAID. We see a lot of the work that AID normally does contracted out to foreign not-for-profit companies. And all of these changes change the incentive structure for the different actors that are involved as well, too. So again, you can have really great ideas, thoughtful plans, but little sort of institutional appetite to sort of see programs through. As funds keep getting cut, there's no sort of resources or just again, institutional appetite to realize what's happening. So you have an extraordinary amount of frustration by people in DC who maybe want to do something good and are trying to sort of negotiate within their own bureaucracy in DC, and people on the ground in places like Cairo and Rabat who are also trying, to carve something out, right? Something meaningful out, while they're dealing with their counterparts in the Egyptian government who, have no interest in it. And in some ways, people in Washington who have no interest or appetite to see things through either. So you get sort of a very hastily applied approach to things, and this is something I wish, might have changed even up until 2011, but really hadn't. But again, this is, just to go back to your question on, how governments were able to sort of appropriate elements of this, of democracy and governance programming. Again, that focus on support for the private sector, support for privatization, components of what we typically ascribe to neoliberal economic reform, gained in more enthusiasm in the early 2000s. And so at a time when Gamal Mubarak, the former president's son, was also talking about these sorts of programs, people in the United States were extraordinarily excited about it, right? Like, this is someone who shares our concerns and shares our ideas about things. At the same time, there was a focus on, having these components feature as part of the democracy and governance programs. And what you see, interestingly, when you look through diplomatic cables, when you talk with diplomats on the ground, is that people were very much aware that things were not working, right? And that things were being basically, again, perversely used by the government to sort of achieve its ends, right? So economic growth does not have to lead to democratization, right? Privatization does not have to lead to, liberalization, political liberalization. So you have, from the early 2000s, a lot of worrying diplomatic cables, interviews that I had with different actors who were involved in these programs, who were saying not only are the elements of these programs not working, in the direction towards democracy that we at first articulated and hoped for, but it's actually having even worse effects. And so a lot of these diplomatic cables were citing, more and more protest within the labor sector in Egypt, more and more contestation over social and economic grievances. And this is, again, years before the uprisings, right? So we're talking between 2004 and 2006. Concerns from diplomats, from AID development staff on the ground of this is not only not working in the way that the US had imagined, but it's also having the effect of alienating partners in Egyptian civil society that we might like to work with. In other words, it's not working, we're losing our constituency, and we're also losing credibility in general in comparison with other donors, like let's say the Germans, the Swedish, etc.
A last question for you, Erin, is to look forward after we've been looking back in this conversation. And I want to ask you where you see U.S. democracy assistance going in our present era. You explain in your book how the emergence of democracy promotion, democracy aid as a tool of U.S. foreign policy was really closely tied up with U.S. conceptions of itself as the example, the exemplar of democracy for the world, spreading democracy through the power of its own inspirational democratic model, or as very closely tied up with U.S. conceptions of power. And in the words of the scholar Jonathan Monton, as you cite him, quote, an almost evangelical belief that the expansion of U.S. power abroad tends to correlate positively with the expansion of democracy internationally, end quote. So 3 decades ago, right at the end of the Cold War, when the U.S. government started maybe on a larger scale funding democracy aid programs in the Middle East and North Africa, at that time, American democracy was relatively healthier, and it was arguably, at that moment in time, a more appealing example of democracy on the global stage. And of course, at that time, the US was indisputably the world's hegemonic power. So fast forward to today, and the situation is very different. At home, American democracy is facing very serious challenges, certainly the most serious challenges of our lifetime. And on the global level, the age of US hegemony is giving way to, of course, a more multipolar world.
Mhm.
So how do you see US democracy assistance fitting into US foreign policy in this new era that we're in?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. It's an incredibly important question, and I wish I had an answer, honestly, for it. It's something I've really been
And a hard one to answer. I'm
yeah,
not sure. I think about
no,
this a lot myself,
yeah.
and it's yeah.
Intellectually, it's really important, and I've was especially have been thinking about this more in two phases. One since 2016, and then again, I think in December, again when thinking about the Biden administration's again rhetorical effort to sort of try and revive efforts to talk about democracy with the Summit for Democracy. Which now in some ways almost seems like that was 200 years ago in the span of everything that's transpired, right, since December. And I remember listening to some of those conversations and feeling, it's like, well, this sounds great, but it sounds also like the same rhetoric that we've heard before, and not much of a sort of tangible plan for how to really get to where, the administration wants us to go, so to speak. This sort of, again, that was in the more abstract discussions about democracy promotion worldwide, but in the region where I spend most of my time working, and that's always been intellectually interesting for me. It seems, unfortunately, incredibly bleak, to be frank, right? So how do those sort of rhetorical, conjectures made in December match, with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East today? I mean, we have, so many examples of egregious human rights abuses, not much of a response from the administration in the same way that we saw before in the early 2000s. I mean, one of the things that, even if one didn't agree with the orientation or the direction of US's democracy strategy in the Middle East, many people have said to me like, well, the US, of course, has a number of contradictory positions in the region. It's extraordinarily hypocritical in what it does in Egypt versus Saudi Arabia, et cetera. But at least in the early 2000s, it was talking about it, right? And so maybe, one small, positive thing you could infer from that is that maybe it makes regimes in the region less likely to disappear people, right? If the United States is at least elevating it to the top of its, talking points. There might be something there to that. And I would say even now, like, well, it's notable that it's not even a bullet point, I think. And that's really worrying and concerning. In some ways, I think that there's an existential crisis about this in this country, of course, and lots of rich discussions about, well, maybe the United States shouldn't be focusing its efforts abroad, but should be turning its focus inward to work on the quality of democracy in this country. And, lots of terrific books. How Democracies Die was, a really excellent sort of overview of what that, what the challenges in the United States are that have, of course, been amplified since that book's publication a couple of years ago. But I think the challenges that we have in this country, not just when we talk about democracy, what is it that we're talking about, right? When we talk about democracy, how do we think about the quality of democracy? Those two things aren't, in my mind, they aren't really they're not a huge focus of academic scholarship as much as they should be. And I think that, my own work in this area has sort of, attuned me more to thinking about the more critical questions we should be asking, right? Not only maybe what the US's role should be with democracy promotion worldwide, but even more fine-grained questions like, okay, well, even when we talk about democracy, again, what are we talking about, right? When we talk about what we're trying to promote, again, what is that vision that we're trying to promote? And, how can we talk more meaningfully about the quality of democracy that we're talking about as well? These are things that, had been, mentioned to me countless times by Egyptians, by Moroccans, back in 2008, 2009. And they're questions I think that we're wrestling with in this country. Again, in terms of thinking about the relationship between the economic sphere and politics, we see these tensions still in the Middle East. We have, again, countless examples of economic grievances still like remaining enormously salient in politics across North Africa and the rest of the Middle East. That again were the focus of everyone's attention in 2011 and seem to have sort of dropped off the radar, but they're still there. And that to me is an important part of the discussion of democracy, right? How are people experiencing, their economic and political systems? How are people responding, to, in some cases, the reconstruction of authoritarian regimes in the region? And what role, if any, is there for the United States and for other actors as well? Because I don't think it's just for the United States. I think this is a conversation that people had maybe back in the late 1990s about, the argument for more multilateral efforts to focus on strengthening democracy around the world.
Thank you so much, Erin. I've been here with Erin Snider discussing her new book, Marketing Democracy, the Political Economy of U.S. Democracy Aid in the Middle East, from Cambridge University Press. And congratulations again, Erin, on the book. And thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much, Amy.